aftermath, I started to realize that, particularly in Kigali, the capital, I was meeting people who kept telling me that, well, at one point or another, in the process of being hunted by the killers in Rwanda, who were basically trying to exterminate the entire Tutsi minority group, as well as any members of the Hutu majority group who were opposed to this extermination, and of the political oppositionists of the Hutu extermination government. I started to notice that a lot of people would say, well, I did this, I had this experience, that experience, but I would meet people who said, and then at a certain point, I arrived at the Hotel de Mille Collines. Now, the Hotel de Mille Collines is the sort of one first-class international hotel where Rwandans, as a matter of fact, rarely can afford to stay, since a room costs about twice the annual per capita average income. It's, in other words, a sort of vestige of the colonial world. I visited Rwanda briefly, and it's a very fancy hotel. And I was told that people went there, that it was the one place in Rwanda where those who sought refuge by the hundreds, close to 1,000 people were there, remained alive. Among the people that I got to know who were telling me this story was in particular Odette and Marie Limo, doctor and husband, who were telling me, and at one point I said, well, what was it about the Mille Collines? Was it the address? Was it that there were a few UN people around? They knew the UN did nothing for Rwandans. What was it? And they told me that one of the extraordinary things was that it was Paul Rusesabagina, who had been appointed interim manager. There was a Dutch manager, excuse me, who, when he was withdrawn along with all the other Westerners from Rwanda to leave Rwanda to its wretched fate, called Paul and said, would you be willing to look after the place while I evacuate to safety? And Paul said, well, certainly. And he went over there with his family. By then already he had been hiding first at his house, and then one day, while he had gathered a great number of his family members around him, he saw a man crawling over the fence of his compound. Rwanda has 10 surrounding fences, and figured, well, they've come to kill me. And I think it was the first moment when I later met Paul, and he told me this story, that I realized the kind of courage he had, which was he thought, well, they've come to kill me, let me leave my family inside the house, and let me go out and meet them. And he went out to meet the soldiers who had actually come for something else. What did Paul Rusesabagina have at the Mille Collines that allowed him to protect people who were staying under his roof? Essentially, he had the attitude of a great hotel manager, which is, these people are under my roof. They are my charge. They are my duty. He had that on a level that was also that of a lot of courage, which depended on basically being willing to recognize that those who were there to take away lives were also those who had the power to spare them. It meant that he was willing to do something that was very morally and physically risky at the time, which was to negotiate with the killers. The killers would come to the hotel because Paul had a good liquor cabinet. Paul made it his business throughout the period of the genocide to conduct trade so that he would maintain a good supply of beer and alcohol so that he could keep in contact with the killers and pay them off. When they came by the hotel, you get a little too. Would you like a little? You get a little too. Now leave my people alone in my hotel. When I asked him once why he had been extraordinary in this period, he said, I wasn't. I really don't think that I did anything extraordinary. He said, people became fools. I don't know why. I kept telling them, I don't agree with what you're doing, just as openly as I'm telling you now. I'm a man who's used to saying no when I have to. That's all I did, what I felt like doing. Because I never agree with killers. I didn't agree with them. I refused, and I told them so. I think that one of the things that I started also to realize was that Paul didn't just have a liquor cabinet, he had a phone line. He had been a young management trainee, I think it was, at the hotel several years earlier when the earliest faxes were being installed around the world, and a fax line was put in, a special phone line, and he realized this phone line was still at the hotel. One of the first things he did was test it. He got a dial tone. Most of the phone lines in Kigali had been cut. And he then used this phone line repeatedly to call everybody that he could in the outside world, everybody that his guests could in the outside world. I've seen copies of some of these faxes that were sent from that fax machine, and some of the memos that were taken, that were sent to the White House, that were sent to Peace Corps headquarters, that were phone calls made to the King of Belgium, there were phone calls made to France. France was the patron of the Rwandan genocide regime. They were supporting the genocidal government throughout, and so they had tremendous influence on the killers, which they rarely exercised. But even so, when people from the Mille Collines called France France would say, leave the Neapolitan alone. That's a problem we don't need to have right now. When Paul was telling me how he used his phone at the Neapolitan to focus international attention on the plight of his guests, he once said to me, but you know, at the Saint Famille Church down the street, which also had more than 1,000 Tutsis seeking shelter there and other people slated for death, they also had a working phone line. And there was a priest there, Father Venceslas, who never used it. In fact, this priest, and I think this is appropriate to mention today since we're commemorating the incredible moral courage of Paul Chaplin, to remember that that courage doesn't come automatically even to those who take the name of God. And in fact, in Rwanda, there were many courageous priests, and there were also many priests who, like many politicians, many doctors, many school teachers, became killers. The story of Father Venceslas, he brought his own mother, who was a Tutsi, to the hotel because he knew that he trusted her to Paul's care, but he didn't trust her under his own roof. Why didn't he make similar calls? Why hadn't more people acted as Paul had? Here was Venceslas with a phone line of his own. It's a mystery, Paul said. Everybody could have done it. But for instance, Venceslas himself wore a pistol while he was a priest. I can't say he killed anyone. I never saw him killing, but I saw him with a pistol, and one day he came to my room in the hotel. He was talking about what was happening in the country, how people were shooting from his church, soldiers with armored cars. He said he gave them drinks because they'd killed people. And I said, Mister, I don't agree with that. And my wife said, priest, instead of carrying your Bible, why do you carry a pistol? Why don't you put this pistol down and take up your Bible? A priest shouldn't be seen in blue jeans and a t-shirt carrying a pistol. Paul remembered that after this exchange, the priest said to him, well, they've already killed 59 priests. I don't want to be the 60th. And Paul responded, if someone comes and shoots you now, do you really think that with a pistol you won't die? But it was interesting. What I was really trying to understand was not what had made somebody like Father Wenceslas weak and so many others who allowed 800,000, who helped to put 800,000 people to death in 100 days. What interested me was trying to understand a little better what made Paul strong under those circumstances. And what was interesting was that he couldn't really tell me exactly. I wasn't really strong, he said. I wasn't. Maybe I used different means that other people didn't want to use. It was only later, he said, when people were talking about that time, that it occurred to him that what he'd done was different. During the genocide, I didn't know, he told me. I thought many people were doing as I did, because I know that if they'd wanted to, they could have done so. So Paul believed in free will. He understood that his actions during the genocide in the same way that he understood those of others as choices, decisions. He didn't seem to think that he could be called righteous, except when measured against the criminality of others, and he rejected that scale. Paul had devoted all of his diverse energies to avoiding death, his own and others. What he feared even more than a violent end was living or dying as what he called a fool. Regarded in this light, the option of kill or be killed translated into the question, kill for what? Be killed as a what? And he didn't think it was a great challenge. The riddle to Paul was that so many of his countrymen had chosen to embrace inhumanity. It was more than a surprise, he told me. It was a disappointment. I was disappointed by most of my friends, who immediately changed with that genocide. I used to see them just as gentlemen, and when I saw them with the killers, I was disappointed. I still have some friends that I trust, but the genocide changed so many things within myself, my own behavior. I used to go out and feel free. I could go and have a drink with anyone I could trust, but now I tend not to do so. So Paul had a rare conscience, and he knew the loneliness that came with it. But there was nothing false about his modesty regarding his ultimate efforts on behalf of the refugees at the Neapolitan Hotel. He hadn't finally saved them. He couldn't finally save them, not ultimately. Armed with nothing but a liquor cabinet, a phone line, and